All right. Good morning from Silicon Valley. Good evening to all of our friends and viewers in the Middle East. My name is Nida Atshan, Senior Program Manager with TechWadi. We are happy to have with us today Amany Killawi. She is the co-founder and COO of LaunchGood, which is a platform focused on the Muslim communities worldwide. So the topic for today's webinar is crowdfunding. Just want to mention that our team, will be live on Twitter, so please do follow us that way. Our handle is techwadi.org, and we will also be using the hashtag TWWebinar series for if you would like to ask any questions to Amany, please use that hashtag and we'll be sure to get that question there. We would like to make this webinar an interactive experience for everyone. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Amany. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're very welcome. Awesome, awesome. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
You can hear me well? Okay, perfect. Need that. Okay, awesome. So I guess Masa al-Khair or Sabah al-Khair, depending on what part of the world you're in right now. I'm going to do a quick screen share so you can see my slides. All right, here we go. Perfect. Is that showing up for everybody? Is that showing up for you, Nidat?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so my goal for this call today, for this webinar, is to really try to demystify crowdfunding. I think there's so much that people are talking about it. There's all sorts of types of crowdfunding, and unfortunately, it's hard to kind of figure out through all of that hype when does it work out and when is it a good idea and what type of crowdfunding is a good fit. So our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. I want to talk a little bit about how it all started, my story, crowdfunding overview, why you should crowdfund, and some best practices for campaigns. And last but not least, I want to really leave a lot of space for questions. So ideally, possibly the last 15, 20 minutes, hopefully. I think most importantly, I want to start with a little bit about my story because I want to set a point in that crowdfunding is actually more about storytelling and about building community than it is about raising funds. And it's befitting that I start with my story because of that. So a little bit about myself, born in Detroit, Michigan, to Syrian immigrants. I actually was a youth and community organizer, and my background was in social work, or in Arabic, I believe it's called مرشدة اجتماعية. And at the time, the first time I ever crowdfunded, I was 17 years old. And when I was 17, I didn't have access to big donors, so I didn't know any doctors or engineers per se. And I didn't have access to the grant system in the U.S. To get sort of support from governmental organizations and things like that. And I naturally just went to crowdfund. And at the time, we had raised about $10,000 to start a incubator space for youth in Detroit, inner city Muslim youth. And then they would pitch their initiatives to investors in the community who gave them seed money. And so when I was crowdfunding, there was very few people in that space that I knew of at the time. This was like 5-7 years ago. And I met my co-founder, Chris Blauvelt, around that time. He had crowdfunded a film called Bilal Stand on Kickstarter. And so together, we realized the transformative power of crowdfunding. We asked ourselves, how can we take that back to the Muslim community? Living in the U.S., it's a small community, it's a minority. How do we take that back? And so we started LaunchGood with that in mind. Now, a couple of things to think about is the fact that crowdfunding is relatively new, but it's been so impactful in terms of culture and community. So if you think of things like smartwatches were started by the Pebble Watch on Kickstarter. The fact that films in the U.S. that go to Sundance Film Festival, a very popular film festival in the U.S., 10 to 25% of them were crowdfunded. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. So a couple facts, LaunchGood is now 2.5 years old. We've helped raise a little bit over $8 million for 700 projects in 50 countries. And again, the focus here is on the global Muslim community. Although the projects don't have to necessarily benefit the Muslim community, it can be led by the community. Couple of things about the market. So crowdfunding is huge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the slide, but it's just fascinating how fast it's grown in the last five years. And this data is actually old. Not only that, but even in the developing world, for it to work well, the community has to be online and people have to have access to credit cards. And that's a big piece of what we're seeing happening globally. Our market tends to be what we call gummies. These are global, urban, educated, Muslim-speaking, English-speaking Muslims, and they tend to be, if you think about the Arab world, if you think about the Middle East, and in general, some of these statistics aren't too they're not too different. So you're talking about 40% under 25 years old. You're talking about so many people looking to make a difference and looking to use technology to do that. So it's really kind of going in that trend. Now, kind of getting to the best part here, what is crowdfunding, right? A lot of times people talk about it, and it's actually not very new. So the concept here is you take a large amount of people who give a little bit amount of money to make something happen. So, for example, I know in my mom's time they had something called the Jam'iyyah, where everybody puts in a little bit of money, and then you now have a pool of money that the collective can use. It's essentially the same concept, but now you're taking it online. So you just you might have the average campaign has about 70 supporters, but if all 70 of those people each gave $10 or $5 or whatnot, it really does make a difference. And the beauty of crowdfunding is that it's supposed to be sustainable for your average person to support. So if I have to give $2,000 each time I see a campaign, it won't do as much as if, for example, if I give $10 to 50, 60 campaigns, I'm more likely to continue giving and I won't be burnt out as a donor. So there's so many types of crowdfunding, and I want to kind of touch base on each one of those. The most popular kind is what we call donation-based crowdfunding. So you're talking about somebody having a campaign for a charity or for a cause, and they need to raise a certain amount of money. Pretty simple. You don't really get anything in return outside of maybe some rewards like a water bottle or a thank you note, but it's specifically focused on donation-based. Then you have pre-sale, which is common for a little bit more common for startups, and I'm going to touch base about this in a bit. But you can have a product, so you're pre-selling something, whether it's a book or a DVD or an app. This is also quite popular, and it's more the Kickstarter model. Then you have debt, so someone might crowdfund loans or crowdfund their loan for school or for tuition. And then you have equity. There's a lot of hype around equity. So the way equity works is that I'm actually crowdfunding seed funding for a company, and when I give to this company, when I give to you, I get a piece of your company. And this is kind of probably I want to say crowdfunding 2.0. It's where everybody's going in terms of I want to say the scene for entrepreneurs. However, there's still a lot of regulations around this, and it tends to change from state to state in the U.S., let alone from country to country across the world. So there's a lot of red tape around this, and it's still kind of, the dust hasn't fully settled. But equity crowdfunding is a very popular concept right now. For example, there was something called a.k.a. It's like a Netflix for the Muslim community globally, and they crowdfunded about 100,000 on a site called Crowdcube. So the ones I'm showing you now are just the tip of the iceberg, because there is over 400 niche crowdfunding platforms. So you've got anything from education to people crowdfunding for their pets to research, and so it's really grown as an industry. However, probably the most popular types of crowdfunding still tends to be donation based and pre-sale. Everything else is still sort of emerging. So why would somebody crowdfund? What's kind of the idea here behind crowdfunding? Well, why not just get a bunch of people in a room and just get some funds from them? And so the first thing to kind of think about is crowdfunding works best if you're launching a really specific initiative. It's got to be tangible. It's got to be related to, it's not exciting to just crowdfund for general operating costs. You've got to crowdfund for something very tangible. The second component is it's about really building community and participation. So a lot of times people think that it's just about raising funds, but more so it's about giving people access to participate in this. So for example, the first project we ever had was the first like Muslim women's workout DVD. 1.6 billion Muslims. No one maybe thought that, okay, what if somebody wants to see somebody who looks like them across the screen when it comes to workout videos, right? And so everybody who participated in that felt like they sort of made history because they were part of that project. And so you have to think of it from that perspective of you're giving people an opportunity to do good, you're giving people an opportunity to participate. And so everybody who can join you can join at whatever level, and that's why it's accessible. If I at 17 could crowdfund, and I as a student or a young professional can give $10 and be part of something, and it's not dependent on me being able to give 2,000 or 3,000 or 10,000, then that makes me feel like I'm part of that. So that's a big component. It's really about that community and participation. And for a lot of people, it's I'll get to this in a second. It's also publicity. In many ways, you're paying yourself to do marketing. The third piece is reducing risk and validating ideas. So before, if you had a product, you had to get some sort of angel investor on board, or you had to, try to get somebody to be the first investor, or maybe you had to go to a VC fund. Now you take your idea straight to the market. You say, hey, people, here's my idea. Here's what I'm trying to do. It's an app that's going to do X, Y, Z. If you believe in it, support it. And if you support it and make it happen, what that tells other people and what that tells investors is that, okay, people want this. There's a demand for this. There's a need for this. And in many ways, that's the best testament. So you can really test that idea. Do people really believe in this? Do people really want this app? And it's almost like churned the funding system on its head, because it's like before, now you can crowdfund first and prove your concept, and then you secure possibly larger investments. So that in itself as a chance to kind of develop that ecosystem of a lot of entrepreneurs not needing to necessarily knock on the doors of certain investors or banks is pretty exciting. And then obviously it's accessible and transparent. So when you're raising all these funds, you've got 600, 500 people supporting you. You're accountable to all of those people, and you have to make that project happen, because 500 people are on board. It's a lot harder to kind of disappear because you have 500 people that you're held accountable for. So a couple of examples here. There's two types of crowdfunding. There's partial and there's all or nothing. Partial is you have a campaign and every little bit helps. So for example, for this Challenge the Darkness campaign in Gaza, every time the more you support, the more lights they can install, right? There isn't this sort of, there isn't a specific end goal. Like there's here it's about 2,000, but for the most part, every little bit helps. And partial tends to be very popular because it's not as risky. You can just raise the funds, raise as much as you can get and use it. However, all or nothing is probably more. It's probably a better model for pre-sales or for any campaign where it doesn't make sense to raise half of the funds. So for example, if I want to click on this Ramadan Legacy campaign, give it a second here. So these guys were crowdfunding an app, and at the time, it didn't make sense to, if they only raised £2,000, they wouldn't be able to make this app, right? The type of quality they needed was not going to happen. And so all or nothing works well if you are able to. It's a great way to test the demand of something. So for example, if you're in the publishing space, right, only if you get $20,000 worth of orders does it make sense to actually publish this book or make that product happen. Sometimes for folks in the manufacturing space, this is the same concept of like you need a certain bulk of you need a certain minimum amount in terms of the orders to actually make the campaign happen. With all or nothing, when you pledge to a campaign like this, the supporters' credit cards are not charged till you hit the goal. So in this case, you support this campaign. It's not till they hit their $5,000 goal or $5,000 goal that I get an email that says, hey, these guys hit their goal, your credit card is now charged. Now, one thing about these campaigns, they are 8 times more successful, right? But they're also 8 times more stressful, for that reason, because it's really, it's stressful because you're trying to make sure that you hit your goal. Because if you don't get any funding. So either you hit that $5,000, 5,000 pounds, or even if you get to 4,050 and the campaign ends, then no one's credit cards are charged, and you don't receive any funding. So again, a lot of times people, when they want to create a campaign, they question, okay, do I aim for partial? Do I aim for all or nothing? So one thing to think about is when you are trying to create a campaign is, number one, ask yourself, okay, what is the type of crowdfunding that I need? Is it donation-based? Is it pre-sale? Am I looking for crowdfunding alone? Am I looking to give people shares within my company? And then if you're in the spectrum of donation and pre-sale, you have to think about, do I want it to be partial, or do I want it to be all or nothing? And what are sort of the risks associated with both of those? One of the beautiful things about crowdfunding is that it's so versatile as a platform. People use it for all sorts of ideas and projects. And you can see here, for example, here sending feminine hygiene care kits to Syrian refugees, helping Moroccan women learn a trade, lights in Gaza, or in this case, somebody like Amany Killawi trying to get the community to support her to be, one of the first hijabi weightlifters at the Olympic qualifiers, or somebody like Dr. Imran, who launches a lifestyle company teaching people Arabic, or how to speak Arabic in a really fun and engaging way. And so one of the things that he did is he created a campaign where basically it was a pre-sale model, so people can actually sign up to his classes in advance, and to him that helps him test the demand of it. Do people want to learn Arabic in a sort of cool way, and that helps him understand, okay, there's a market for this. I can take this to another level. So I show these case studies intentionally so that you can get a sense of how versatile it is of a medium. So now to get into specific strategies around crowdfunding. Let's say you've decided that you want to create a campaign, you're doing donation-based or reward-based, and now you want to know, okay, so what do I have to take into account? How do I prepare a really good campaign? How do I tell my story in a way that's exciting? And what's the strategy for that? So a couple of things to think about is the crowd always comes before the funding. So the idea here is that you have to have a crowd before you start fundraising. And a lot of people ask me, okay, well, I don't have that many people on Facebook. I don't have a lot of followers. I'm not necessarily a nonprofit that has a following or a certain personality, and that's okay, because actually your friends and family are your inherent crowd. And a lot of people don't realize that, is that if you can't get your friends and family initially to support, then you don't have a very good chance of getting people beyond that network to be on board. And so, the first thing you want to think about is your crowd. Do you have that crowd? And it will depend on that social capital. The second component to think about is crowdfunding is more about publicity than it is about fundraising. So I'll give you an example here. Amany Killawi, for example, right? Even if she doesn't hit her $10,000 goal, just by the nature of people sharing her campaign and supporting it and it being on Facebook and Twitter, that actually opens up opportunities for other people to come by. So sponsors have reached out to her and said, hey, we love what you're doing. We want to sponsor you. Or, we're big fans of this. How can we support you? So think of it as really that publicity is a key component here. You'll notice sort of a spike in your likes. You'll notice a spike in terms of people who follow you, and that's because that publicity is the best component. In terms of good versus bad crowdfunding, this is kind of really important to understand. It's a bad idea to crowdfund for operating funds. Nobody's excited about supporting anyone's salary. So for example, you've got, let's say you have a nonprofit and you're trying to raise $10,000 to keep your doors open for the next year, right? That's not very exciting versus you're a nonprofit and you're starting a new program within your nonprofit that's going to provide access to youth who are out of school and teaching them, for example, a certain trade, right? Think of it like this. Let's say you have a company. If you're crowdfunding to test the demand of a certain product, it's much more exciting for people that you're coming out with a certain app than for people just to support your consulting company or the start of your company. That's not really exciting. In terms of needs, you always have to think of it as publicity plus money versus just money. So if you're thinking of just money, again, that's sort of a very it's a very narrow way of thinking about it. You want to really keep in mind that that storytelling is the biggest component, because at the end of the day, people will give because of your story and the impact you're trying to have than just, hey, I need XYZ to make this happen. And then in terms of the goal, I really want to focus on this because you hear a lot of success stories of people raising millions of dollars through crowdfunding, but what people don't realize is the average crowdfunding project in the crowdfunding world is only about $4,000. That tends to be the norm. On our site, it's about $10,000, but roughly, if you're trying to raise more than $100K, it's exceptionally hard. You're better off doing equity crowdfunding, or you're better off, having sort of specific investors come in. Again, because crowdfunding is about participation. It's about getting a lot of small donations from a lot of people to make something happen. So 1 to 20K tends to be just sort of the right amount. It's feasible enough that you can make a campaign happen, but it will still require a lot of work. But again, it's more about bringing on board, 600-700 people to be your initial participants, and then engaging them after the campaign when you develop the product or when you develop the initiative. You have to have social capital. That's important. And so if you have, even if you can't have like 2 friends on Facebook and crowdfund. That won't work, right? You do have to have somewhat of a network. It doesn't have to be necessarily, it doesn't have to be like you don't have to be a celebrity per se on Facebook. But if you think about, you have 300 friends and your friends have 300 friends and other team members on your team have a couple hundred friends, all of that collectively does equal about 1,000 in terms of your network. So keep that in mind. You do have to be online because if you create a campaign and you don't have Facebook, you don't have Twitter, you don't have a page, it's like going fishing with a broken net. You're just, you want to capture that publicity, but because you don't have some place where people can go to, you're losing out on a lot of that. So make sure that you do have some of those pieces together before you launch a campaign. It's a bad idea to crowdfund alone. It's actually not fun, but if you do it with a team, you can spread it out across 3 or 4 people. Pretty self-explanatory. You always get more done with a team, but specifically with crowdfunding, because it's about pooling everybody's networks together. So an example of what does a campaign actually look like? Like, what are the elements of a good campaign? So you know what? I'm actually going to take you right to the campaign. Oh, I guess this is still pretty good. So typically you have a title. So here, this is actually our first ever project. It was a workout DVD for Muslim women, or really all women. And so you can see here, the first thing you have is a title. Now, I think one thing that I always tell people is that we don't read like we used to. So most people won't even read all of what you say. Probably like 10% of people who come across your page are going to be reading the whole thing. But for the most part, people are going to read your tagline, which is right here, and the first paragraph, and that's about it. And the reason for that is, when you're talking about the online medium, people are distracted. If your video is not exciting, they're not really going to pay attention, right? And so it's important that you cater to that. And the first things you want to think about is that tagline, right? When I share this on Facebook and Twitter, this is the first thing that comes up. A cutting-edge DVD workout series for all women, feel good inside out, right? And then this picture shows up. Then what people will do is they'll look at Beyond Skin, they'll look at this first sort of paragraph, but for the most part, you have to really tell your story in that first paragraph. And you really have to, this tagline is so important. Think of it like this: if you had to tweet what you're doing, and if you had to explain in a tweet what your campaign's about and why it's important, this is your tagline. And so it's kind of like and then your mini elevator pitch is right here. And then for anybody who wants to read more, they can, read through the rest of the campaign. So the first component you want to think about is when you create your page is that people don't read, and you got to keep it simple. What is it that you're doing? Why is it important to support right here? And then the rest of the details within the campaign page. Typically you have a goal. So here they have 15,000, and this shows you the number of supporters. And then here you can't see it, but you have a deadline. What's unique to crowdfunding is that campaigns have typically a 30-day deadline. And that's important because people procrastinate when you ask them to give. And you need to kind of have you need to have a deadline where you're like, okay, this campaign's closing in 30 days. Either you're part of it or you're not. And the other component of it is you have to be pushing the campaign for all 30 days. So it's exhausting to do more than a 30-day campaign. And on top of that, people kind of get bored. So after 30 days, it's like, okay, you have to move on. Like, you don't want to be fundraising the whole time. You just need to fundraise for that set amount to be able to actually make whatever it is you said you were going to make. And so the deadline is very important. And like I said, it tends to be about 30 days long. Some people might do 40, some people might do 2 weeks, but you have to count on being able to push it for that whole time. So you've got your amount here, how much you're trying to raise, and then you've got your, the specific, how many days, 27 days, 3 days, etc. left. And then here you have what we call the reward levels. So people can support your campaign at different giving levels. So for example, if it's a product, they can actually, basically purchase the product in advance. Now, a lot of people ask me, what are good giving levels? What are the things we should take into account? And I always tell people that the most common giving level is like $25 roughly. And the reason for that is because, like I said, it's what's most accessible for most people. You can still have some people give at larger levels, like 1,000. They might ground your campaign, like you might have 1 or 2 donations that come in at 1,000, but for the most part, you're going to get in between the 25 to 50 or in between the 25 to $100 giving level. Now, you want to make sure that you have giving levels across the park because it makes it accessible for everybody. So people can give at 10 and people can give at 1,000 if they want, but it's important to have those options. A couple other things to think about is a good pitch has videos, images, headers. So headers are really important because, again, people don't read, so you have to basically tell your story through these headers right here. What is this about? What is it? People will really scroll through it, and if you're able to tell that story and convince somebody in 10 seconds, oh, this is actually pretty cool, I want to support it. So in terms of it's always fascinating to me when people submit a campaign and I say, okay, would you donate to this campaign? And they say, oh, probably not. And so it's important that your campaign looks exciting, it's emotionally engaging, it captures someone's attention, because it's really about first impressions when it comes to crowdfunding pages. So that's a little bit about how the page looks and feels. I want to talk a little bit about strategy. Now, there's a lot to discuss in strategy, but I want to focus on 4 points. The first point to think about is teams that have, projects with teams tend to raise twice as much as projects without teams. And again, that's because you're pooling your collective network. So before you create a campaign, try to really get on board 2 or 3 other people. The more people you have on board, the better. You know, if you can get 3 or 4 people on board for a $10,000 campaign, that's awesome. If you have 20, if you're trying to raise 20,000, try to have 5 or 6 more people on board. Another thing to think about is you want to create a hit list, and this is what we call basically before you launch, you create a list of all the people that you could reach out to. So think of it like this: if I know 10 people in my book club, if I know 5 people in my soccer club, if I know another 10 people at work, and then I've got my friends and family, my uncles, my aunts, etc., I'm making a list of all of these people's names. And what I'm doing is you're mapping out your network. You're saying, okay, you know, Amany knows 30 people here, Ahmed knows 15 people there, you know, Layla knows 6 people here, and we're going to reach out to these folks before we launch. And that's important because a lot of times people just want to launch and they just expect that people will support their campaign. But really what you have to do is you've got to line up your supporters even before you go live, which number 3 is a big piece here. You know, if I need to raise $10,000 to create an app, I've got to basically try to get 30% of that funding through pre-commitments. So if I can get 30% of my funding by asking people in advance to support, then I start off my campaign with a big bang. A lot of times, you know, if you know, because one thing to think about is people are fundraising all the time. So you get bombarded with all these causes, but when you reach out to me in a very personal way, like there's nobody else involved, and you say, hey, Amany, I've got this awesome app, and this is the impact it's going to have. Can I count on you before I go live in a week to be one of my first supporters? Here's the link, right? That's really key because people feel invested. They feel like, wow, you reached out to me even before you're going live. Like this is really special, and they're much more likely to actually be your supporters on day one. One thing to think about with anytime you do something with a whole group or a whole jama'ah is that what happens is nobody wants to be the first supporter. And when your campaign is up and it's day 1 or day 2 and you only have 2 supporters, it doesn't look really good. But if you line up those people and they support on day 1, that's exciting because people say, oh, wow, like, you know, clearly, like, already you've gotten $3,000 in funding, already you have, you know, 40, 50 people on board, I want to be part of this. So it's important to make that hit list, reach out to those people in advance, and get them to pre-commit to give to your campaign. The second piece around that is there's something called the bystander effect, right? So a lot of times people post campaigns online, like through Facebook and Twitter, and that's really good, but that shouldn't be your only strategy. You want to supplement that with the one-on-one ask. I have to go to people and ask them personally. Because what happens if you post and say, hey, there's this and this campaign, support, and you're posting that on your Facebook, and I see that, it's like you're talking to 500 people, but you're not really asking me to support, you're asking 500 people to support. And so people tend to get into the mentality of, okay, somebody else will give or somebody else will support, you're not really asking me personally. So while you should share it on Facebook and Twitter and do this mass sharing and share it in forums and listservs, you also want to supplement that with, in fact, that should be your prominent strategy, is you want to supplement that and really reach out to people on a one-on-one basis along with mass sharing. And we've got a lot of people who get frustrated, like I'm posting it on Facebook, I'm posting it on Twitter, nobody's supporting it. And that's, like I said, because there's that bystander effect where it's like, okay, you're not really talking to me, you're talking to 500 people. So people can kind of, it diffuses that responsibility. Number 4, in terms of follow-up, you know, when you crowdfund, it's like a roller coaster. So you'll get most of your support in the first week and most of your support in the last week. And again, the first week people are excited, they're on board, you're kind of just pushing it out there. Then there's usually a dip in the middle, which is very common. A lot of times people are like, what's going on? You know, nobody wants to support, and it's very normal. There's just a little bit of a lag. And then the last week, you'll notice a lot of people coming to support because it's like, okay, there's only 4 more days left. I have to either I do this now or I don't. And one of the techniques that we always tell campaign creators is you've got to really be persistent in your follow-up. So you've got to track who you reached out to. You've got to track when was the last time you reached out to them. You've got to constantly follow up. And it's a balance. So maybe a couple times throughout the campaign where you let people know, okay, we've got a week left. Now we've got 3 days. Now we've got 48 days. And again, you'll notice that most of the support will come in the last 3 days, and that's because people procrastinate. So unless you give them a deadline, a lot of times people have a lot of other things going on, and they'll say, oh, okay, all right, now we'll support. You have 1 day left. I'm on board. Couple pieces around crowdfunding.
So, Amany, can we go back to strategy, and perhaps could you elaborate a little more on how persistent to actually follow up? So, can you give us maybe a concrete number? Do you follow up every other day, once a week? And
Yeah.
then I'm assuming you're saying that because people are more likely to fund during the end of the time frame or the deadline, do
Yeah.
you recommend then that you follow up more frequently at that point?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I get this question a lot of, okay, so am I going to be nagging at people if I'm like reaching out too much? What's the fine balance? And I always tell people it really depends on kind of your relationships better or your social capital better. But there's kind of two periods. The first period is even before you go live, you reach out to those people. You want to be persistent in making a list of those individuals that you can reach out to. And one thing I forgot to mention actually is part of that is influencers. So, or you can also call them connectors. These are people who, even if they give, that's great, but really the value in reaching out to them is they're part of a larger network, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, they have access to so many other people, and when they share your campaign or they post about it, people listen to them. Their word means a lot. And when you're able to also ask them to sort of, if you can get a pre-commitment from them to share your campaign when you go live, like that's pretty key as well, because they're able to take your campaign to a larger network. And so in terms of before you launch, yeah, it's definitely key to be persistent about creating that list and reaching out to those people. Again, individually, it takes more work, but you have to think about it like you are cementing some of these relationships, like you're going out one-on-one and asking somebody to support. And then the last week, yes, the last week you definitely want to be very persistent because it's the last 5 days, it's the last 3 days. Again, a lot of times people just forget. Like they just, there's a lot of other things happening. They're just not paying attention. And you want to be posting every single day, letting people know, okay, we're at 70% now, we're at 60%, we're $300 away from our goal, we're $200 away from our second milestone. So yes, in terms of that, you do want to be very persistent, especially in the beginning and especially in the end.
Great, great. And also on the topic of being strategic, you mentioned that no one wants to be the first person to give. No one wants to be that person. So I guess, is there a number that you would say, or a percentage of your target that you feel one should have committed before launching their campaign?
Yeah, 20 to 30%, generally speaking. So about 20 to 30%. If you're able to get that, and again, even though I say it's 20 to 30%, crowdfunding is such a roller coaster that you really don't know till you launch what's going to happen, which is kind of fun and a little bit nerve-wracking. So we've had campaigns who, were 40% away and there's like 3 days left, and then they hit their goal in the last 3 hours, right? And it's really a roller coaster ride. But it doesn't mean you can't really prepare for it and try to set the tone, at least in the beginning, where you do have control.
Great. All right, thank you.
Sure. I'm almost done here. I'm going to wrap up in a bit, and then maybe we can do some question and answer, because I think that a lot of times people have specific case studies they want to bring up, and those tend to be where a lot of the learning happen. A lot of the learnings happen. A couple things to think about. I mentioned some of these. It's a bit, not to scare anybody, but the statistic tends to be that less than 10% of projects hit their goal. However, one thing that we find fascinating is that our success rate is about 43 to 50%, and that's because there's a personalized coach that we assign. So for a lot of people when they're crowdfunding, And part of the reason why doing this webinar is that if you've never done it before, it can be a little scary at first, right? Like you're putting yourself out there. It might feel like you're putting yourself out there. You're not sure what to expect. And to have somebody be able to walk you through it and say, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's where you should really put your time and money into. Like that's really key. And another thing to think about is for a lot of people to just, it's only 30 days, so you want to maximize that time as much as possible. Most people crowdfund, if they have a campaign in mind, they generally work on it a month in advance, and then there's and then it's about 30 days to actually launch the campaign. So you're talking about 2 months of your time, essentially, to really put together a solid campaign. You can always do it, there's always exceptions, like you can do it within 2 weeks, and then launch prepare for it within 2 weeks, and then launch a campaign for 30 days. But it depends. If you're doing something like a product, you've got to get the prototypes, you've got to get all the pieces of that. If you're doing some sort of humanitarian campaign, you don't have to have that much out there because it's the ask is quite simple. Couple other points. I already mentioned that 80% of the funds will come in the first and last 3 days, sometimes the first and last week. It's everybody, so you'll get most of your donations from small donors and a good chunk from large donors as well. But the bulk of it is going to be those $25 donations, those $100 those $100 giving levels. And then number 4, which I think is key, is this goes back to the bystander effect. People can still do Facebook and Twitter, but sometimes a good old-fashioned phone call is actually the best way to go. And I know for a lot of people my age, it's like, oh man, I have to talk to people on the phone. Like, I don't know if I want to do that. But in many ways, that one-on-one, reaching out to people on a one-on-one basis is the way to go because it cuts right through it. Like, I am asking you specifically to support versus just putting it out there and kind of hoping people will support it. And again, I can't stress that because all the campaigns we know that have been successful have done this where they've created a list of people they can reach out to personally, and then also supplemented that strategy with, mass sharing. A couple points to think about. You have to be passionate about it. It's hard for you to get somebody to support something if you don't feel strongly about it. So if I don't really believe in what I'm doing, how can I sell that to you and tell you, hey, product is awesome, you need to support it? So what's cool about this is that when you're working within your team, it becomes a great exercise to be able to practice your elevator pitch, to be able to practice how to tell your story in a way. And so you have to really be passionate about it. It's a crazy 30 days, and being able to care about it matters a lot. I already talked about preparing 2 weeks ahead of time. Number 4 is key. People will give for emotional reasons, not for logical reasons. And what I mean by that is, logically it doesn't make sense to give away your money. But emotionally, if your story is appealing and I feel connected to it, I give because of that. I'm not gonna. People won't give just because it makes sense. So a lot of times people, when they put their campaigns together, they tend to get very technical. So they'll say, okay, here's what we're trying to do. Here's all the specific dimensions, all those pieces. And that's fine. There's room for that. But as long as that first section of your campaign is very emotional, it tells a story, it tells you what need you're trying to solve, then you have the rest of the campaign to get into those logistics of how much you really need, where is it going, the specifications, all of that. And then a couple other things is have fun with it. I mean, it's 30 days. It's, you might not sleep for a bit for those 30 days. You might wake up every day and check how much you're doing, how many people have supported. But it's when you have a team and you're able to check in with them on a weekly basis and you're able to hold people accountable, it's actually not so bad. And you'll be surprised at, I've been doing this for 2.5 years now, and I've worked with over 700 campaigns. Until this day, the power of the crowd never ceases to amaze me in terms of when people collectively get together to support something. The potential is just amazing. So that's a little bit about. Hopefully, I've given you some quick synopsis of crowdfunding 101. A lot of times people ask me, how do we get started? You can just submit a campaign, we assign you a coach, and then you go live. I think I want to leave it now, maybe now that we can leave it for questions and answers. I don't know how you want to do this.
Yeah, definitely. We've had some questions come in actually. And Amany, thank you so much for sharing your insight. I think everything that you just shared with us is extremely, extremely beneficial, not just to innovators and entrepreneurs, but really anyone who has a project that they'd like to raise funds for. So the first question is from Rama Chakaki, our executive director, our interim executive director. And the question is, how large should your social network be for a campaign to be effective?
Yeah, so it depends. So for example, like I said, the average crowdfunding project is about $4,000 in the crowdfunding world. And if you're one person, like you could probably raise 4,000. That's not bad. But we're talking about you want to have at least a couple hundred, friends on Facebook for you as an individual. And then think of it, in terms of, for example, if you're trying to raise 10,000, you want to have maybe double that, right? It's not necessarily there isn't necessarily a specific formula for that. Some people have thousands of friends on Facebook, but their social capital isn't really rich in terms of they can't go to those people and actually ask, right?
Right.
So you want to think about quality over quantity. In terms of mass sharing, it is great if you have hundreds of followers on Twitter. That's like again and again we see that people who have a crowd have a much better sense of like what it is they need, what kind of crowd they need to raise those funds. But even if you don't have a specific if you don't have hundreds of friends on Facebook, if you have a solid network of friends and family, that will go a long way, and then you can reach out to influencers after you've already built traction into your campaign and say, hey, can you help share and promote this? Because if you're reaching out to me, for example, and I have 50,000 followers on Twitter, and I see that your campaign is like 60% there, I want to be part of that winning team. I do want to share that. I do want to push and promote that. But if you're coming to me as somebody who maybe only raised $100 and telling me to share it, it looks like you haven't really done your work or you haven't done your part. So there isn't like a straight answer to it. Again, it's more about that quality, because your initial ask is going to be to people you know, people you trust, so those friends and family, and they're going to build a foundation of it. And then you'll notice that once you get to 50%, 60% raised, you'll find that you're going to get support from people you don't even know. It's going to be like friends and friends and friends, and it becomes a ripple effect.
I see. So would you say then that there's really no way to measure the dollar value for an individual follower on whether it's Facebook or Twitter?
There's been some studies around it. I'm a bit skeptical about that because we've had people share it with we've had people say, hey, I have 16 people on my team, and our collective network is like this much, but the campaign won't do as well. And then we've had people who might not be, you sort of when you first look at their Facebook profile, it's not that many friends and family, but they're able to, like, I have people who are like aunties raise funds, and they actually kill it. They do a great job. But that's because they have really solid social capital. They have these relationships that they can go out to. So some people put numbers on it. I'm a bit uncomfortable with putting numbers on it just because it's not necessarily, I haven't always seen that to be the case. The other extreme is that if you have nothing, like if you don't have a Facebook profile, you don't have Twitter, you're not online at all, then definitely it's not a good idea.
Nice. You've kind of already addressed then one of the questions that we have here, which is, can you estimate the amount that you'll make based on your social reach? And do you have anything else to add, or would you say we pretty much covered that?
I kind of covered that already. It's hard to tell till you launch, but generally, if the way I like to answer that is between those two extremes. Like if you're trying to raise more than 20K, and you're not, you don't have a specific team on board, and you're only like one person, that's going to be very difficult. But if you are one person and you're trying to raise something around the ballpark of 2 to 4K, it tends to be pretty doable. Yeah.
Great. So another question we have is from our chapter in Palestine. I want to welcome the group there and thank them for joining us. I know they had some technical difficulties. But the question is, what is the strategy to engage with people in non-US countries, like in MENA or in developing countries?
Yeah, yeah, and so this is always a fascinating question because um, it's crowdfunding, to be honest, tends to be a largely white phenomenon. So you're talking about Western countries, in the U.S. you're talking about sort of white upper class, and so when we go out to the Muslim community, which isn't necessarily that demographic, we have to do a lot of education. And anytime you're like the first in a space, you have to do a ton of education to help people realize the potential of it or help them kind of understand the power of it. So a couple things from a technical standpoint, as long as you have a credit card, as long as folks have a credit card, they should be able to give. Like that's pretty straightforward, and they're online, right? Crowdfunding doesn't work in sort of cash-based economies. So, for example, we're talking about like if people aren't used to going online or people don't trust giving online, it's a bit more difficult. Although, because we've worked with the Muslim community extensively, we have an option where you can add offline donations. So somebody cuts you a check, somebody writes, gives you cash, you can add that and it reflects. So from a technical standpoint, is folks have to be online and they have to have access to credit cards or PayPal or be able to do that. In terms of the education piece, two things. I think one thing that we came across is that a lot of times people don't realize that even $10 goes a long way. And so when it comes to education, when you as a campaign creator, when you make your campaign, you sometimes have to educate people that like, look, I'm not trying to get you to give 5,000 or something like that. Like actually your $10 goes a long way. Like your $5 goes a long way. And you have to sort of help your crowd understand that it's about participation and it's about everybody giving a little bit. So that's the first piece. The second piece is sometimes people don't understand all or nothing model, where they're like, okay, I gave to the campaign, where's my reward? Where's my DVD? Or where's my, how can I access this product? And we have to let people know that no, it's about like, you have to hit the goal first, and then it tips, and then everybody gets what they want, right? So that's a second component. Is one, making sure that people are online, and then two, you have to do a little bit more education around how it really works, and that understanding of like collectively, just that $10 or that $5 really goes a long way.
Very good. I'd like to follow up on that a little bit because you mentioned pretty much anywhere where you can use a credit card or you spoke about just local payment gateways. So I want to ask about places in the Middle East that don't necessarily have those banking gateways.
Mm-hmm.
So how then do you recommend that countries like Palestine, for example, can get past that lack of a local payment gateway to set up crowdfunding?
Yeah, and just to clarify, when you say payment gateway, do you mean in terms of where the
Uh,
funds are going to?
like banking, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So this is a good question because it is difficult in some places. For example, like I believe in Algeria, you have to have like a bank account, and to have a bank account, there's a lot of regulations and restrictions around that. One of the things that we've done is that sometimes people will create a campaign on behalf of an entity in the Middle East. So, for example, you can have somebody in the U.S. or the U.K. or wherever crowdfund for a project that impacts a certain, like let's say it's those lights in Gaza, right? Someone can create a campaign on their behalf from the U.S. And it becomes something that the whole world can access. Now, in terms of the payment gateways, we're pretty flexible. So a lot of times we try to find the best ways to send the funds over. So this could be, in some cases, this could be using something like Stripe Connect, which automatically sends funds to their account, or it could be through, as funny as it might sound, Western Union. I think the most important thing um, for us as a platform that we found is the logistics of it don't matter as much at the end. Like we find a way to get the funds over, but most importantly is giving people kind of that opportunity and that platform and a portal to be able to raise those funds. But I can see how it can be tricky in certain cases. One of the things we do is before you launch is we just try to figure that out in advance. Okay, what are the options? Before you go live, it's like, can we send funds this way? What about this? What about that? And once that's established, we're able to set up a campaign and use different payment mechanisms to make it happen.
Great, great. Okay, so we have another question that came in from our partners in Syria. I want to welcome everyone in Syria as well. Thank you all for joining us. The question is there an Islamic crowdfunding, and what is the difference between that versus a traditional one?
Yeah, that's a good question because, what is Islamic, I guess, is one way to look at it, right? Because in many ways, there is a whole growth within this industry in terms of if you think about recently there was like a crowdfunding alliance, the Islamic Crowdfunding Alliance, and maybe I can share the link afterwards. And you have a bunch of platforms that got together to provide different options for people in the crowdfunding space. So if you think about interest or interest-free options, real estate, equity, crowdfunding, all of that within the boundaries of certain Islamic guidelines when it comes to, when you say musharaka or when you look at interest-free loans and things of that sort. So I can post that link. I don't know enough about that space in terms of when you talk about equity and you talk about those platforms that focus on kind of the technicalities that work within that. But what I can tell you is the way we identify ourselves is sort of culturally Muslim. So in our case, it's more about than identity per se. So, we're not really interested in getting into conversations around sectarian issues or sort of political dilemmas or any of that, because for us it's more about people identifying as Muslims. So whatever that identification can mean, like culturally, lineagely, all of that. And what's fascinating about that is you have, that's how we operate within that niche. And what's interesting about that is you'll notice that if you try to be everything for everyone, you kind of just become mediocre. But when you focus on a specific community, it actually works out very well in that case because. One of the things that we found is there's very few identity-based crowdfunding platforms. So if you think of niche-based crowdfunding platforms within the Islamic space, there's a lot out there, and the ones that sort of identify as Islamic tend to be ones that focus again on interest, not working with interest, looking at some of the more specific ways of Islamic finance, whereas our platform is more kind of culturally loosely affiliated. But I can send a link to that to you maybe, and then that'll give you a sense of like what else is in this space. And this is, this term is still being defined now. A lot of times you can kind of slap halal on something, but it's like, what does that really mean? And I think what the community is coming together is trying to put guidelines around these things. Like, what does it mean to say Islamic? What does it mean to say something's halal? Is that enough of a label? What are the guidelines behind that?
I see. Okay, so I want to try to squeeze in a few more questions. I know we're running out of time, but another question we had from Surya was about getting people to not think that this is fraud. The question is specifically about people in the Middle East having a tendency to think that, oh, this is not real, it's fraud. So how do you overcome that barrier?
A couple things. I think one component to think about is it does help if you have a fiscal sponsor on board. So what that means is if you have an organization backing you, like specifically if you're a nonprofit, right? If you have, there's this nonprofit that we're partnering up with. There's several pieces to this. On one hand, we vet projects, so that does help in terms of being able to see, like, okay, what's a good campaign and what's not. Two, one of the fascinating things about the internet is that you can actually do most of your detective work just by a Google search, right? And you can tell a lot about, if somebody has a page and it's got traction, it's got a following, they have a crowd. It tends to feel a lot more legitimate than going to a page that only has 2 likes, and you can't seem to find any information about what their office is and who's the team behind it. And the third piece of this is that because it's about transparency, you do have to showcase like who you are. Like you can't crowdfund anonymously. Like that's never a good idea. So you have to, say, hey, here's the team, here's who's behind it, here's our Facebook pages, here's the other entities we're working with. And then the last component is that actually the crowd ends up serving as a checking mechanism. So one of the concepts here is that if 500 people support a campaign, that means 500 people believe that this is somewhat legitimate, right? And so that also serves as like a kind of a final check within all of those pieces.
Great, great. Okay, and so another question we have from Palestine actually is, what do you think about a startup hiring a PR manager to lead a campaign?
Yeah, I'm particularly not a fan of those. I haven't seen them work too well because I see it as a supplemental strategy, but not the main strategy. And the reason is because it's going to go back to those personal asks. It's going to go back to your friends and family. And it's not something that you can necessarily easily outsource. So yes, as a supplemental strategy, but not as the only thing that you'll utilize.
Great. And on the topic of strategy, they would also like to learn a little bit more about the difference between choosing strategies, particularly debt and equity.
Yeah. I'm not too familiar with debt-based crowdfunding platforms. There are, a lot of the, maybe in terms of the follow-up, we can post a link for the other platforms that do that. But, in terms of equity, the strategy for reaching out to people tends to be the same. So if it's debt or if it's equity, you still have to make those one-on-one calls to action. You still have to line up your supporters in terms of who you can reach out to. And you also want to do the mass sort of outreach. So those pieces are the same, but when it comes to choosing which platform, that's a bit of a different case. I don't know enough about equity to comment on how that works, per se.
Well, okay, and so that brings me to my last question, which I think is a good way to wrap up. So there are so many crowdfunding platforms, I mean, pretty much for every project under the sun. What would you say makes one crowdfunding platform better than another?
Yeah, so it depends on your needs. I think a couple things to take into account is a lot of times people assume that if they're on a larger mainstream platform that's just going to bring them supporters, but actually you bring your crowd to the platform. It's not so much about that. I think one of the things to keep in mind is sometimes going with a platform that is a lot more personalized, a lot more accessible, a lot more one-on-one support means a lot more than going to something larger. So for example, Amany Killawi, when she launched her campaign, she was a hijabi weightlifter in the UAE. She went to GoFundMe, which is sort of like the McDonald's of the crowdfunding world. It's very easy to create a campaign, and so she only raised about $80 in 3 months, right? Mm-hmm. And that was sort of a mainstream crowdfunding platform. But what was a game changer for her when we worked with her one-on-one is that she had a coach who was able to say, hey, Amna, this is what you need to do. Here's the different pieces of it. And so for her, she appreciated the one-on-one support. And that went a long way for her in terms of educating her crowd and being able to really understand how to make it work. So that's one thing to think about. Sometimes, though, if you are launching a product that's quite mainstream, it might make sense to go to sort of mainstream platforms, right? If you're trying to get access to a larger community, yes, that would make more sense. But you have to think about first, like, what is it that you're trying to do? What are your needs? And then think about the success rate of the types of campaigns the type of campaign that you're trying to launch on some of these platforms. So if you're in the publishing space, trying to see like which platform tends to have the highest success rate for campaigns within that space, or tech or certain products. And I think from there, being able to make a decision on that is probably the smartest way to go.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much, Amany. I believe we're out of time, so with that we can wrap up. I think, I mean, crowdfunding it's taking the entrepreneurial financing world to an entirely new level. So it was really great to hear from someone as successful as yourself, Amany. Thanks again, and thank you to all of our partners and everyone who's viewing today's webinar. If you have any questions that you would like us to send to Amany, please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, on techwadi.org, or feel free to email us directly at info@techwadi.org. So thank you, everyone.